So in this segment, we're going to be discussing the UK's failure to create post-Brexit chemical regulations risks quite irreparable damage. So they did discuss this on Newsnight a couple of months ago when they did the Brexit special, where there was a guy who works in the chemicals industry. He said he was paying ridiculous amounts of money to a third party based in the EU in order to get kind of information on the REACH program or something like that, so he could get his chemicals into the EU, and it was madness. Honestly, he said he was spending ridiculous amounts of money because of Brexit red tape, and it was wild. And this is just more kind of off the back of that, in my opinion. So the UK's chemical sector has warned that attempts to create an affordable post-Brexit regulatory regime for the industry were floundering and risk causing, quote, irreparable damage to British businesses. This is about the UK being out of the REACH programme. Not only is REACH the best Halo game, or joint best, but in the EU's context, it deals with the registration, evaluation, authorisation, and restriction of chemicals. So you have to register your chemicals with them. They're tested to ensure they meet EU safety levels, and that takes time and money to do. For the UK to set up a rival to it, it means we have to basically do all of the same tests, so long as we have, basically the same rules as the EU, and the companies have to do that for a smaller market. Double the cost, but it could also be double the time, because the UK rival is still not up and running yet, and the fact is we don't have as many staff as the EU do. So what that means is our checks take longer because we haven't got the people or the expertise to do it. So companies who want to manufacture these chemicals in the UK or import them from the EU are facing real issues here. The frustrations emerged after more than 18 months of negotiations between the industry representatives and the government over how to build a regulatory system for a sector that is vital to UK's manufacturing. More than 95% of manufactured goods contain chemicals. This will range from like basic chemicals, the ones with labels on them saying irritants, and the more dangerous ones. We use chemicals across the board for manufactured goods, as they say. All of them have to be registered regardless of if they are imported or made within the UK. They have registration and testing. After Brexit, the UK quit the EU's REACH chemical management system, but has repeatedly delayed the introduction of its own arrangement after a government impact assessment discovered it would cost the industry £2 billion to duplicate the safety data that Brussels already held. And I wonder how much the EU would charge us to have access to this database, if they would allow us it, if we paid money, for example, like Norway do. And this is one of the things that we got with our contribution to the EU's budget, and we benefited massively from it. And because it was paid in by other member states as well, it was cheaper to do because it was not a single country paying, but a group. You also had the expertise of this whole group as well. It's a game changer. These are some of the reasons why Norway pays so much into the EU's budget, because it's cheaper and easier for them to do it this way rather than creating their own system like the UK has decided to do. However, attempts to broker a deal with the industry to reduce the cost of re-registering 22,400 chemicals with a copycat UK REACH system run by the government's health and safety executive are failing to bear fruit, according to senior industry figures. Tom Boatwell, the chief executive of the British Coatings Federation, called for a, quote, reset in the negotiations, adding that talks on creating a lighter touch model were, quote, not addressing many of the concerns that led to that pause in the first place, end quote. So they're talking about a cut down REACH model. A cut-down model for the regulation of chemicals. How stupid are they? We have seen that in the US, where people can get cancer and other illnesses due to some chemicals that have been regulated as safe until people take the makers of these chemicals to court and sue them. We've seen that with certain chemicals that give people cancer. And they don't have long to live. Like, even the money they get from it, they don't have long to live from that. Would they take being paid out hundreds of thousands to have only a few years and probably stage 3 or 4 cancer, or live a longer, happier life? I don't know. For the UK to do this would be incredibly stupid, but again, they're no stranger to that. The industry argues it is needlessly expensive to duplicate registrations where chemicals have already passed safety tests in the EU, but for legal and intellectual property reasons, the underlying data for those registrations is not available to the UK regulator. I think it's because we don't really pay into the system, and amongst other things. This is the argument around the UK CA mark as well. But, if we go down this road, we're basically hoping the EU does all the work for us regarding chemicals, i.e. if we just go off kind of the EU's data, effectively. And if we do that, the UK can change our REACH clone into something that deals more with intellectual properties and patents, I guess, if we just kind of copy the EU. But, but doing this sort of stuff it's not always a good idea, in all honesty. But, that's the model the UK could be looking at. However, conservation and environmental groups have said that unless the UK regulator is in full possession of the data, it cannot regulate effectively, which is kind of what I'm talking about. But Boatwell said, quote, a quote, suboptimal, end quote, application of UK REACH could cost British industries billions of pounds, and accused the government of lacking the, quote, application and creativity, end quote, required to find a solution, saying, quote, if genuine progress is not realised quickly, there is a risk of irreparable damage, and not just to the UK chemical sector, but to downstream users and formulas of chemicals, end quote, he said at the BCF's annual conference. And I'm not fully sure what he's talking about here. If the UK does just say, if the EU allows us, then we're just going to copy it, I don't know how that causes irreparable damage. I think it would impact people using some chemicals to turn them into a different kind of chemical, and that would make some sense if that's what he's talking about. But without access, to the base chemical data, it would be risky for them to do so. And who would regulate for these new chemicals? Because the UK would have to wait for the EU to allow certification of them, if that makes sense. So I'm not 100% sure what he's talking about here, but just copying the EU data is just not a good idea. Jeff Mackrell, the boss of Hull-based Teal and Mackrell, a specialty paints manufacturer that employs 70 people, said the prospect of UK REACH requiring full duplication of existing EU chemical registrations could cost him crucial suppliers. Now this bit's important. With some chemicals only occurring at trace levels in certain products, he warned that several European manufacturers would inevitably decide it was too expensive and time-consuming to duplicate their EU registrations to serve a smaller UK market, saying, quote, our products are made up from a large menu of chemicals, but if an EU supplier takes one of those chemicals off the menu, then we have to reformulate, which is both expensive and difficult, end quote. He further added, quote, the fear is that we'll lose the ability to make products and innovate, end quote. And this makes sense. In order for these supplies to sell into GB, it means they would have to register with our REACH clone, which would cost them a lot of money and time. If it's not worth it for them, it means the UK will lose out on these chemicals, and some industries may cease to function without them. That's what he's talking about. They'll have to reformulate what they have, which is probably pretty difficult. I'm no chemist, but chemistry is not easy, and I imagine it's not easy for them to work with not all the stuff they need. Also, the innovation point makes sense, because if you innovate and make a new chemical, it means you have to re-register it and blah, blah, blah. Steve Elliott, the head of Chemical Industry Association, the sector umbrella organisation, said the UK approach was at odds with recent pledges by Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, to boost advanced manufacturing through smart regulations that was designed to foster innovation, saying, quote, unfortunately, such an outcome appears currently beyond us with regard to REACH, whilst the clock ticks on companies are having to make choices over future investment amounts and locations, end quote. It goes to show that the Tories have a lot of buzzwords, smart regulations and all of this stuff. Chemicals are not a thing you want to mess around with. The UK having to replicate functions the EU already did is pretty funny to me. Like, we're spending billions of pounds in order to do the basic functions the EU carries out. These are the parts of the EU which were not really talked about enough, and still aren't, in my opinion. The regulatory bodies, the groups that do the research and all that kind of stuff. Having a single group dealing with things like chemicals and aviation just makes life easier for the entire single market. So long as it's done right, it can work really well. And to be fair, so far for the EU, it has worked really well, and I hope that continues. Because the American model, where they say, the chemical's only bad until it's proven it's bad, is just stupid. That's how you get people getting all sorts of illnesses. Whereas the EU model is more, you have to prove it's safe. If you can't prove it's safe, we ain't using it. And I think that's a much safer model, and it's a much better model as well. And it goes to show you the different kind of mentalities of these two, well, the EU and the US. But for the UK, we're trying to have the best of both worlds, I think, where we're trying to not pay as much as we should do. And also we're trying to have the kind of strictness that the REACH program has, and it doesn't make sense, but this is what the UK are currently doing. And to be fair, no one said this lot made sense anyways, but I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.